We wanted to organize, all of us, these conversations in New Hampshire around the question of reform because reform has been a central passion of New Hampshire politics for more than 20 years. Indeed, it was exactly 20 years ago this year that a great New Hampshire woman, Doris Haddock, aka Granny D, began her walk in California at the age of 88. She walked all the way across the country, arriving in February 15 months later. At the age of 90, because her birthday is in January, she had walked all across this country, literally risking her life many times to make it, having a sign on her chest that said, "Campaign Finance Reform." And it was in this state that John McCain in 2000 made corruption a central part of his campaign, and this state rallied to John McCain in 2000 because people here get it. And they have gotten it for 20 years. And they understand that if we don't find a way to fix this democracy, all of the issues people are talking about, all the dreams, these ideals, these hopes, are just hopes. We have to find a way to get a democracy that's responsive to us. So when we had this idea to have these democracy fora, we wanted to talk to candidates, and I reached out to a bunch of candidates, and every one of the campaigns said, "Oh yeah, we're really interested. This is a really great idea. Let's talk to the schedulers." And of course, the schedulers never seem to have time to schedule an event. But I reached out to Andrew, who happened to be, we were Twitter followers, mutual Twitter followers, and I DM'd Andrew.
We had a Twitter bromance going.
Yeah. And I said, "Andrew, you got to come to these." And just like that, he's like, "I'm there." And I talked to his scheduling people, and just like that, they picked the date. And so we are here with Andrew to launch this because he is, as you will hear, committed, as all candidates ought to be, to talking about this issue and finding a way to get our government to this place. So here's how we're going to play this right now. Andrew is going to have a chance to lay out why he's a candidate for president. And then we have a series of questions we're going to walk through. I've got some, there's going to be and then there's going to have a bunch coming from the audience. And I hope by the end we have a clear sense of where everybody is on this question of reform. We don't have to stand for 90 minutes. We have these really fancy chairs right here that we can sit in. But let me start by welcoming Andrew Yang and express our gratitude that you're here with us.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Larry. I'll stand for this at least. You can take a seat, Larry. Thank you so much. It's great to be back here in New Hampshire. And first, let's give Larry an enormous round of applause for leading on this issue, because I've been a huge admirer of his for a long time. So I gave to the May Day PAC when it first came out. I was like, ooh, like a PAC to end PACs. Like, I'll definitely send money to that. I was a huge admirer of his run for the presidency in 2016 around this issue, around campaign finance reform. You know, I loved it because it was smart, it was laser focused, it was clear, and then the fact that the DNC didn't include him in the primary debates, we were just joking in the front row here. And he said, "I really love the fact that the DNC actually has objective criteria this time." And then I was like, "Do you regret not running again? Because you totally would have made the debates this time." And he did not answer, so I guess he does not regret it. Which I understand. So hugely passionate about the issues that Larry has identified. And you'll see, I believe today that I am with you all on the need to recapture our democracy for the people, and that the state of New Hampshire is the greatest hope for our country in terms of making that happen. If it does not happen here, it's not going to happen anywhere else, because New Hampshire understands this set of issues much more directly and personally, and you all have a much more sophisticated political culture where you actually feel like the future of the country is in your hands in a way that other states do not feel. So it's a pleasure to be here. When he reached out to me on Twitter, I was like, heck yes. And then, I told my team, and I actually have a team where if I say to do something, it generally happens, like in a reasonable time frame. And so I've been looking forward to this date for a long time. Those of you who don't know who I am, actually raise your hand if you know a whole lot about Andrew Yang, and do nothing if you know nothing. All right, it's a real mixed bag. So I went to high school here in New Hampshire. I graduated from Phillips Exeter Academy. They just invited me back to speak about a month and a half ago, which was really interesting because I had not been back since I'd graduated. So I graduated from Exeter. I became an entrepreneur. I sold an education company to a public company in 2009. And then I had this deep sense of foreboding because we'd just gone through this financial crisis. And I was like, oh my gosh, like our economy is evolving in ways that it's really marginalizing more and more Americans. So I quit my job and I started a nonprofit organization called Venture for America that helped train hundreds of young entrepreneurs to create thousands of jobs around the country in cities like Detroit, Cleveland, Birmingham, St. Louis, New Orleans. And during those 7 years, I realized that our economy is evolving in even more fundamental ways than I had realized from 2009, where the reason why Donald Trump won in 2016 was that we automated away 4 million manufacturing jobs in Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Missouri, Iowa, all the states he needed to win and did win. And then my friends in Silicon Valley know that what we did to the manufacturing jobs, we will now do to the retail jobs, the call center jobs, the fast food jobs, the truck driving jobs, and on through the economy. We're in the third inning of the greatest economic and technological transformation in the history of the country. It's called the Fourth Industrial Revolution. And we're reacting to it in one of the worst ways possible. We're reacting to it by pretending it's not happening. And so this is linked to the campaign finance issues because our democracy, in theory, would provide a feedback mechanism where if, let's say, we had an economy that was becoming increasingly inhuman and punitive, and 78% of Americans were living paycheck to paycheck, and 57% can't afford an unexpected $500 bill, and your life expectancy were to decline for 3 years because of a surge in drug overdoses, opiates in particular, and suicides, then in theory, your democracy would actually advance figures that might do something about the increasing inhumanity of the economy. And if your feedback mechanism is broken, which it is now, because now we've been overrun by corporate interests and the voice of the people has gotten muffled and silenced, then you wind up with something like a Donald Trump in 2016. And to me, the most disgraceful part is that as a country, we are still not even trying to figure out solutions to the problems that got him elected. Instead, we're blaming various symptoms and not trying to cure the disease. And unfortunately, the disease is getting worse. It is metastasizing. So these are the things that have come together to lead me to run for president. And as you've probably noticed, I'm not a politician. I'm a serial entrepreneur. I'm a problem solver. But this set of problems is among the most serious we've faced in decades. And we need to wake up to the fact that it is not immigrants that are causing economic problems around the country. It is the fact that technology is pushing our economy to a point where more and more Americans are going to have trouble getting by. So that is why I'm running for president. That is why I'm here with you today. And I am so pumped to answer the questions about campaign finance reform because it is vital that we take it back for the people of this great country. Thank you.
Great. Okay, but I wanted a little bit more of Yang for...
Oh, there's tons of Yang. I figured I had like 90 minutes. And I didn't just want to speechify the whole time because I've got this brilliant moderator and co-conspirator. Like I wasn't going to talk everyone's heads off. Larry.
But so here's the question. I want you to give us 2 minutes on really an incredible idea that you've been pushing, which I think more people need to think about, which is this question of universal basic income.
Oh, yes. All right. Ask and you shall receive. So my flagship policy is the Freedom Dividend, which is almost named after New Hampshire. But it's a policy where every adult gets $1,000 a month, free and clear to do whatever you want starting at age 18. And here in New Hampshire, that would mean about $8 billion a year in additional monies coming through your hands. And if you were to get $1,000 a month, just imagine I'm president in 2021, thanks to you all, thank you New Hampshire. And then the $1,000 a month comes back into your hands. Where would that money go? How would you all spend it? Student loans, buy a house, what was the other one? Coffee, I think that was what I heard. So, how many of you have noticed stores closing around where you live here in New Hampshire? Now, why are those stores closing? Amazon, that's right. Amazon's like a giant black hole sucking up $20 billion in commerce a year and is now pushing 30% of Main Street stores and malls to close. So that's what you're on the receiving end of. How much did Amazon pay in federal taxes last year? Zero, that's right, less than each of us. And I would guess that, that probably seems messed up to you all, that $1 trillion tech company should not be paying zero in taxes, even as they're soaking the vitality up out of your communities and neighborhoods. So my plan is to go to Jeff Bezos and the gang and say, hey, all this money you're sucking up, we're going to return some of it to the people of New Hampshire in the form of this Freedom Dividend. Now, after you get this $1,000 a month, a little bit of it would float back up to Jeff and the gang. Like you'd buy an extra toaster or something. But most of the money would stay right here in New Hampshire, right? It would go to car repairs you've been putting off and tutoring for your kids and food and healthcare bills. It would grow your economy here in New Hampshire by about 15,000 jobs. And then this virtuous cycle of an economy that works for you all would become real. And one of the reasons why the Freedom Dividend is so important is I talked about my family. My wife is at home with our 2 boys right now, one of whom is autistic. What is her work valued at by our market economy? What is her work valued at by GDP? And we all know that's perverse. We know that what she's doing is among the most important and challenging work for our society. So the Freedom Dividend would not just put economic resources into your hands in this time of historic change, but it would also begin to recognize the uncompensated and unrecognized work that gets done in our homes and communities every day. So that is the flagship policy. The shorthand to everything I just said is that there's an Asian man running for president who wants to give everyone $1,000 a month.
Okay, so we have a democracy, quote unquote, where members of Congress spend anywhere between 30 and 70% of their time raising money to get back to Congress or to get their party back into power. And that process of sucking up to the tiny fraction of the 1% who are writing them checks, maybe 100,000 Americans, changes them.
Oh, yeah.
And changes,
oh, yeah, it's terrible.
And changes the ability of our democracy to function. So the first core question to think about when we think about how we're going to reform this democracy is, what do we do to change the way we fund campaigns?
Yeah, so I know he's going to like this because I checked it with him. So my plan to help restore our democracy is to give every American adult 100 democracy dollars every year that you can only give to candidates and campaigns, and you use it or lose it. So it disappears if you don't spend it. But what he just said about calling people and sucking up for money is exactly right. It is soul crushing. I have had the unfortunate experience of calling a rich person and asking them for money, and I hated it, and I was like, I really would not like to do that again. And so if we can make it so that if I get, how many people are in this auditorium? Let's call it several hundred. So if I were to get several hundred people behind me, let's call it, I'll make it a bigger number, let's call it 10,000 people here in New Hampshire behind me, and you all had $100 you could give to a campaign, then that would be $1 million. And then I could spend all of my time trying to figure out how to represent you and serve your interests, as opposed to calling some 1%er and asking them for $20,000. So if you align the money and the people, then that changes the responsiveness of your representatives. But right now, the brutal truth is that I have to do something to appeal to the people, and then I have to go to my car and then call people for money. And that is going to destroy us. Now, I'm actually giving you a hypothetical because I actually don't call anyone for money when I go back to the car. I have my campaigns now raising hundreds of thousands of dollars in increments of only $18. So my fans are even cheaper than Bernie's. Thank you for all the Yang Yangers here, and thank you for being cheap. It's beautiful. But because of my cloud of supporters, I do not have to have that soul-crushing experience of calling some rich person and sucking up to them for money. And as a result, my motivations are very pure, and that's what we have to do for every congressperson. And for the life of me, I do not understand, because if you get them alone and you say, hey, do you like calling people and sucking up for money? They're like, oh no, I hate it. Where's part of the job? And then it's like, then why don't we just get rid of it? And then there's like, oh, it's just the way the system is, or something like that. And it's so dumb. I'll tell you, if I had to spend 30 to 70% of my time doing something I thought was brutalizing and not in the public interest, I'd be trying to get rid of it immediately.
Yeah, so So the biggest reason they don't get rid of it is uttering the words you just uttered takes real courage. Because the reality is we know how politics works. People who start talking about solving this problem the way you're talking about solving this problem are attacked immediately as people trying to give out welfare to politicians. So when you get hit with the welfare to politicians argument, what are you going to say in response? How are you going to defend that argument?
I'll say, look, this helps align incentives for elected leaders to represent the people that put them into office, as opposed to having to curry favor with rich corporate interests or individuals that can then buy access to them on the side.
Okay, so the consultants say Americans aren't smart enough to understand what you just said. They're going to hear welfare and they're going to stop thinking. They're not going to be able to recognize this alignment of incentives. Are the consultants right, or are you right?
We're going to find out. Am I right, people in New Hampshire? But I think that people are smart enough to know that we put money into your hands, it's good for democracy, and that the American people are smart and wise and judicious enough to put that money to use.
Okay, so the other striking feature is, I'm happy you're here first because I did know that this is a position you took. It's striking how few are willing to actually utter these words. I think Bernie was a big reformer in 2016, but whenever he would talk about public funding, it was something for the long term, something in the future. Do you think that the other candidates are actually not convinced of it, or what do you think the reason is we don't see this as the thing they talk about first?
So what would be easy for a Democrat to say would be something like, we need to repeal Citizens United or constitutionally overturn it. That would be a very high legal standard. It would be quite difficult. It's much easier to argue I'm like anti-corporate money than it is to say I just want to put more resources in the hands of everyday citizens. There's still like this very, very deep mistrust of people that's baked into a lot of our political discussion. And so I think that's one of the points of resistance for other politicians to say that the best solution is just to put more economic resources into the hands of voters.
Yeah, so this repeal of Citizens United, you're right. This is the central response that both Democrats and Republicans, remember even the president talked about super PACs as being an abomination for democracy. But the standard response is, let's find a way to overturn Citizens United so we can suppress the speech of all those. But that's a very different response to the kind of response you're talking about here, which is not about necessarily silencing, but it's about empowering other people to be relevant in the speech market.
Yeah, and the truth is, even if we were to somehow successfully overturn Citizens United, you know that the economic resources would still be in the same hands. It'd still be the same individuals, the same companies, and they'd find a way. It's like that. There's never been a time when they didn't at least find a way to somehow get access and influence. So if we were to put $100 into the hands of Americans, I did the math. I like math. And so it turns out that even if a minority of citizens were to use the $100, let's call it 30% of Americans would actually use the $100 to support their favorite candidate, it would still be a much larger sum than all of the corporate lobbying budgets combined.
Yeah, so that would change things dramatically. Okay, that's issue number one, and absolutely agreed. This is fundamental. Let's talk about issue two that's really important right now in New Hampshire. You heard in the list of sponsors a lot of people whose name included ranked choice voting. And we have an active movement going on right now in New Hampshire to establish ranked choice voting for the presidential campaigns. And so just make sure everybody understands what this would mean. It would mean you go into the ballot box at the primary and you would say, I'm for so-and-so first, maybe people here might say Yang first, and I'm for so-and-so second, and I'm for so-and-so third. And then if your first choice doesn't happen to get more than 15% of the vote, which is the cutoff to get delegates in New Hampshire, then your second choice would be counted. And if your second choice doesn't get that vote, then your third choice would be counted. And the process, of course, would therefore give us candidates that most Democrats actually are behind, as opposed to giving us a list of candidates, each who gets 10, 20, 30, 40% of the vote. So you've announced your support for this idea. And I wonder if you could explain to us why you think that helps our democracy to have something like ranked choice in the system.
Yeah, I'm a huge fan of ranked choice voting, and if you, oh good. I'm for other things you like too. So, I mean, right now our process is, it's like this first past the post system. It ends up squelching diversity of perspectives. And what happens, and you'll hear this every cycle, where it's like, don't waste your vote, don't waste your vote. And so maybe you like this person, but that person might not have like a 51% chance of winning, and so people are like, oh, like, don't do it, don't do it. And so you end up not expressing your true preference, and then you say, okay, I'm going to end up voting for this person instead. So what that means in practice is it ends up rewarding and protecting incumbents. It makes it harder for third parties to arise. And in the extremes, it can even completely change the result from something that the majority of voters intended. Let's say, for example, Donald Trump in the last cycle, where there was a whole slew of Republicans, and he might have been the last choice of a lot of people who went to other candidates. And in a ranked choice system, he might not have performed as well, because a lot of people wouldn't have necessarily had them as their second choice. So it's huge. It would be a huge increase in the efficacy of our democracy in terms of its actual representing the will of the people if we were to have ranked choice voting and you could express your true preferences.
Yeah, and so, yes, thank you. And you can feel the dynamic in this race in particular. So take the issue that you champion, UBI, which again is an issue that America has got to think about. I think it's a really important idea that we need more people to talk about. And if you're in a race where ranked choice voting was going to determine who the winner of the election was, other candidates would be eager to engage on the question of UBI, because they would know, even if they're not going to get first choice vote from Andrew Yang supporters, maybe they'll get the second choice or the third choice. So this issue, which is not right now at the center of American debate, becomes all of a sudden relevant because they're eager to wow people who would support you. As opposed to a system where it's first past the post, they're like, okay, this issue is just a fringe issue. There's no reason I need to talk about this issue. So it's oddly a way to bring outside views into the debate, whether or not they ultimately win.
Yeah, so I would be for ranked choice voting even if I were not in this race, but it would help some. It would help someone like me. It's true. It would also help to mainstream this consideration of universal basic income. And one thing I was very heartened by is that there was a recent poll that showed a majority of Democrats are for universal basic income. So if a majority of Democrats are for this policy, I should not be the only person championing it. There should be other Democrats getting on board, and ranked choice voting would make that more likely.
Yeah. So how many people here are actually in favor of ranked choice voting? Can you raise your hand? Okay. That's a lot of people. How many people here...
What's your second choice?
How many people here have reached out to the incredible New Hampshire legislature to tell them you're in favor of ranked choice voting? Please, at least 5 people's hands go. Okay, great. So this is the reality. The Democrats in the legislature are taking the lead right now, in the Senate in particular, to try to make sure this happens. It's not going to be easy to make sure it happens by the next election. So this is a real opportunity for you to do something that could have a significant effect, not just for Andrew's campaign, but I think more importantly for the capacity for this democracy to actually reflect the views of the majority. So this is your homework assignment. I'm a professor. I give homework assignments. This is yours. Please, whatever you do after this, tell your representatives here what you think about this idea that Andrew has been talking about. Okay. So we don't have any disagreements so far. We're going to find some disagreements, Andrew. This is important.
No, we agree on most important things, I think.
Let's talk about an issue that's, in a small state, not as significant, but across the country becomes really significant: gerrymandering. So right now, Congress is filled with representatives who come from districts that have been gerrymandered. They've been gerrymandered to be safe seat districts, which means if you're a Republican in a Republican safe seat, there's no chance the Democrat's going to beat you. If you're a Democrat in a Democrat safe seat, there's no chance the Republican's going to beat you. And what that tends to do is make it so those incumbents are focused almost exclusively on the even more extreme version.
Not getting primaried, yeah.
Yeah, not getting primaried. So if you're a Republican, you're afraid of being primaried by an even more conservative Republican. If you're a Democrat, you're afraid of being primaried by an even more liberal Democrat. And so that dynamic takes an already polarized American Congress and makes it look even more polarized. So it's a really critical problem to figure out, what do we do to reform the system to make it so that kind of gerrymandering doesn't happen? A lot of ideas out there about this, but I wonder if you've thought about this in the list of 400 issues you've actually given us a policy position about.
Well, I couldn't agree more that gerrymandering ends up favoring incumbents in a particular way, and then it also, unfortunately, leads to more polarized policies, because then you're just afraid of the most extreme element of your party trying to challenge you instead of trying to appeal to the middle in that district. And I know that happily that there are some groups working on this problem. I don't have anything innovative to add except to say that to the extent that we can try and pull back some of the redrawn lines to something that is more along with historical norms that would lead to a more demographically or ideologically diverse place, like we should go in that direction as fast as possible.
And so there have been two kinds of solutions that have been pushed. The most common has been at the state level. So for example, Michigan recently passed a ballot initiative because a millennial put a Facebook post up immediately after the last election. Katie Fahey put this Facebook post up and said, anybody want to work on gerrymandering in Michigan? And within 6 months, she had 5,000 volunteers in Michigan who collected more than 400,000 signatures to get a ballot initiative on that ballot, and then Michigan overwhelmingly voted to end partisan gerrymandering in Michigan, evincing what I think is a really important fact, that the people desperately support this kind of reform. And the most interesting principle that Katie Fahey brought to that fight was nonpartisanship. Nobody was allowed to utter anything about their partisan affiliation in that fight. It was a pure citizens first fight. So that's the grassroots. But the interesting alternative, which Congress has recently considered in the H.R. 1 proposal, is for Congress itself to say, you can't draw congressional lines using partisan gerrymandering as your principle. And so I wonder whether between these two, you have any clear sense of which you would push for, or which do you think makes sense?
Well, certainly, if Congress, and H.R. 1 I support just about every single aspect of that bill, and I'm furious at the fact that the Republican-led Senate is quashing its consideration. And so if we can make that happen legislatively, then that could have, because you can't expect there to be a Katie Fahey in every state or every district, it's like, and that's actually something I find maddening when someone's like, let some activists somehow organize thousands of people. It's like, when that happens, it's fantastic, but we need to build a better functioning government than that doesn't require there to be an army of activists in every district or every state. So as you can tell, I'm for the legislative solution.
So you want to get to this solution as quickly as we can.
Yeah, I mean, we're, as you all can sense, we're like decades behind or years behind in many of these areas. So it's one of those things where it's like, the best time to have done it would have been 20 years ago. But failing that, we should do it as soon as possible.
Okay. And so one really exciting thing about these democracy forums is that our next round of them are in the beginning of May. And Katie Fahey is going to be a co-host with these because she is deeply committed to this reform movement as well. And so I think she also would love to see it as quickly as possible from the federal level, but when the federal government's not doing it, you got to do it yourself.
And I will suggest that this is, because I think New Hampshire is, I'm happy to say, more drawn to this, but you can kind of tell, I'm a non-politician and a systems thinker, and I see the systems like, hey, we should really do something about that. And I don't have any vested interests. And I'm going to suggest that it might take someone who has no investment in a given system to help fix it, and then so that other people who might have, frankly, a ton of debts or obligations in the existing system, that they might not like it, but they might not be able to do something about it, whereas someone like me can do something about it as fast as possible.
Yeah, and that was certainly one of the most effective things the president did in the 2016 election, was to be able to stand up there and say, look, I'm not like any of you. In fact, I've bought most of you because most of you are politicians, and I've given all of you money. And whether or not one believed what he was saying or believed that his commitment to reform was genuine, what was important is it demonstrated how significant it is to the voters that they see somebody who's interested in fixing the system who's not themselves a part of the system. And I take it this is going to be the biggest push for your kind of candidacy.
Yeah, that's why I love it. I can't believe it takes courage to point out what everyone already knows. When you said that, I was like, really? Like, that seems so odd.
Okay, so here's another problem that's not as dramatic in New Hampshire, but is a terrible problem around the country: the suppression of the vote. So, America is unique among mature democracies in handing over the process of registering and enabling people to vote to essentially partisan machines. Now, that doesn't mean everywhere they behave in a partisan manner. Indeed, I think many places, Iowa and New Hampshire in particular, the operations are very respectful of the principles of neutrality. But in some places, they don't tend to function like that. And so you see the vote suppressed in really outrageous ways. So in Georgia, which was the most extreme example, I think, in 2018, you saw the Secretary of State, who, oh, by the way, was running for governor himself, who changed the system for voting booths all across the state to make it harder for Democrats, who also happen to be black, to vote than for Republicans. And I just wonder what you think we can do as a nation to deliver on what should be an obvious first principle of a democracy, that we all have an equal freedom to vote, and that ought to be guaranteed regardless of your party or regardless of the color of your skin.
Yeah, so one thing I'm for is making Election Day a national holiday. I mean, that would free up people's ability to vote, at least on the day of, and make it so that people don't have to choose between a shift of work or their paycheck or a day's wages necessarily and showing up at the ballot box. Now, you're right that a lot of this does rest in the hands of individual states and secretaries of states. So I would love to try and do things that you can do at a national level. So some of the things I'm for, this actually gets mixed reviews. I'd love to hear what you think. But I'm for lowering the voting age to 16. Because if you can get someone to vote younger, then it actually ends up establishing a lifelong pattern of voting very, very quickly and early. And to the point, and it would also transform our high schools into hotbeds of actual democracy. Instead of having hypothetical votes, you could be like, look, if you're a junior or senior in high school, you're actually going to be able to vote. Get them in the habit early, and it would also help represent the interests of young people in our democracy because they're going to be on this planet longer. So it's like it makes sense to me that they'd have a say in what we do. So there are things that we can do on a federal level that help just enhance the accessibility of voting. If there's a way we can help undo some of these voter suppression efforts that are going on in Georgia, then I'd be thrilled to do so. But I get the sense that at least in some cases, they are in the hands of the individual state parties.
And automatic vote registration?
Yes, automatic voting registration, I'd be all for that. We should make it as easy to vote as possible. Our turnout rates are quite low in the scheme of things internationally. And you're right that part of that is deliberate. Part of that is that people just want to make it a little bit harder for certain types of people to vote, which means, in my opinion, then that they must know that something is going on. Like if you're practicing democracy effectively, you should not fear the voters.
Yeah, so then what about an incentive solution here? So imagine the federal government said, we send money to every state, but we'll discount it by the proportion of people who don't vote, or who aren't registered to vote. So if only 80% of the eligible voters were registered to vote in your state, we'll cut the amount we're going to give your state by 20%, or take 20% off.
Yeah, I love incentives. It's like a race to the top for registering voters. I love putting resources to work in that way.
Okay. All right, so here's an issue that we might find a little bit of disagreement about, or two. First of all, I'm sure many of you have, because many of you are supporters of Andrew Yang, but if you have not, you should go to his webpage, because he is the candidate who has articulated more policy positions and his position on more policies than any other candidate. I tried to do a comparison, but I mean, I can't even remember, I couldn't even count because I'm a lawyer. I can't count that high. But how many of them are there? Because there are like 6 pages here in my notes of these policies.
I think right now we're at 86.
86, okay. So among those policies, many of which, are really powerful and interesting, there's one that stuck out for those who think about reform. You said that what you're interested in doing is returning us to a system of earmarks in Congress. Now, earmarks are the ability of members of Congress to basically say, this money should be spent this way in my district, and this money should be spent that way in our district. And what's striking about that is that, 10 years ago, there was a big fight to get rid of earmarks. This was one of Barack Obama's signature reforms. And even the Tea Party joined with Obama to say, yeah, we should get rid of earmarks. But you want to bring earmarks back.
Yes.
So explain to us exactly how this is not enhancing corruption, or what exactly you think earmarks would give us that Barack Obama didn't think they would.
So if you're in Congress, right now, I think Congress's national approval rating is approximately 12% or something along those lines. Like no one likes the job that they're doing. And if you're an individual congressperson, back in the day when the majority leader came in and was like, hey, we're going to try and pass this bill, they'd look at it and be like, I'd be more receptive to this bill if this museum in my district got, money for renovation. And so then they had this like horse trading that went on, and then it made it more possible to do good things, or just get work done in Congress. But now because of the incentives that are set up, if I go in and I essentially just kneecap every legislation and say, I'm going to stand on principle, we're not going to do this, we're not going to do that, then there's no room for negotiation. Your incentives aren't there to actually be a team player with your party. Whereas in the day, the incentive to be a team player was, frankly, your district would get some goodies. Now, you can look at those goodies and say those goodies are a waste of taxpayer money. Or you can look at the goodies and say, apparently the goodies were necessary to have a higher functioning legislature. And every once in a while, the goodies that people brought back to their district might actually have been a good thing. And so I've taken the latter stance, where if you look at our seized up democracy or legislature, you have to look at it and say, why can you not get anything done? Why do only 12% of Americans approve of you? And part of that is that they can't negotiate with each other anymore, because if the person who's sponsoring the legislation wants to get you on board, they can't offer you any goodies anymore. So it turns out I'm a fan of goodies. And it's one of those things where it's like a cost of this much to enable like this much of potential benefit.
Okay, so the standard skepticism about that among reformers goes something like this. Yeah, that's a happy story about goodies, because it's about leadership handing out goodies in order to get laws passed in Congress. But there's another way goodies might be handed out. For example, you might say, geez, if we could get a bunch of money from the board of directors of this university, we might find a earmark could go to support research in that university. So the charge about earmarks was that they were a kind of corruption. They were a kind of way in which members of Congress could shake down private people or interests or businesses that wanted these goodies so that they would channel money into the campaign. So is that not a problem, or is that a problem you're going to solve in other ways too?
Yeah, so certainly you don't want to open the door to blatant corruption or influence peddling along those lines. But I think that there's a way to bring back earmarks while also putting guardrails up to say, look, you can't be trading campaign contributions for access to goodies, or you can't be personally enriching yourself or people that you know. But to me, those are two separate issues. And that you can hopefully have intelligent guidelines to keep it from getting out of control the way it has at least some proportion of the time been in the past.
Okay, let's try that again. Let's say there are two related issues, because let's take the first issue we're talking about. If you had a non-corrupt way of raising money...
Yeah, it's true.
Okay. You can finish the sentence then, right?
Yeah, so if you have a non-corrupt way of raising money, then I don't need to bring you the goodies in order to get money back, because as long as they represent my constituents ably, then they'll give me the money. And then whether the university is trying to do some kind of back scratching, it doesn't actually affect me.
Yeah. So this is, I think, a really important insight. I don't think any other politician is defending earmarks. But I think they're defensible as long as you also make at the very top of your list of what you're talking about doing, fixing the corrupt way that we fund campaigns. Then I think they could be defensible. Okay, so that's one where we don't have to have a disagreement. Here's a one where there's a lot of contestation out there right now about this. How many people love the Electoral College? Okay, I see one. Great. Okay, we have one person who loves the Electoral College. So let's be clear about what we could talk about with the Electoral College. There's a bunch of your colleagues who are talking about abolishing the Electoral College. That's cheap talk, because to abolish the Electoral College requires an amendment to the Constitution. That requires at least 2/3 of Congress or a convention, and both of those seem like not real paths. So it's easy to talk about, but not really easy to think about actually doing something about it.
Yep.
But if you think about what the real problem with the Electoral College is, the real problem, it seems to me, is not the problem that people sometimes obsess about, which is that every couple of elections it seems now to not select the winner of the popular vote. And in fact, we can show that's going to increase over time. We're going to have more and more cases where the loser of the popular vote would be selected by the Electoral College. But that's not the real problem. The real problem is a problem that happens in every single election. And that is that because all but 2 states, Maine and Nebraska, allocate their electors in a winner-take-all way, so if you win the state, you get all the electors of that state, that means the presidential campaigns know the only states they need to care about are the so-called battleground states, the purple states. Because there's no reason if you're a Republican to go to Texas. You're going to win Texas. And there's no reason if you're a Democrat to go to Texas. You're going to lose Texas. So Texas is just not a place you're going to campaign, neither New York, neither South Carolina, none of these states. The only states you're going to spend any money on or any time in are the battleground states. So in 2016...
Unless you're sucking up to rich people for money in that state.
Okay. You stole my punchline, but that's okay. In 2016, 99% of campaign spending was in 14 states. And 95% of campaign time was in 14 states. The other 5% was in the non-battleground states.
Was in Los Angeles, New York, San Francisco.
Exactly right.
Boston.
To raise money. Okay, so you stole it again. That's not fair. Twice you've stolen my punchline.
Hey man, I'm running for president. I actually live this stuff.
Okay, so this dynamic of winner take all produces a president who represents the battleground states. But here's the thing about the battleground states: they don't represent America. They're older, they're whiter, their industry is kind of, middle 20th century industry. There's 7.5 times the number of people in America working in solar energy as mine coal, but you never hear about solar energy in a presidential campaign because they happen to live in Texas and California. You hear about coal miners because they live in the battleground states. So this problem of winner take all is the thing that makes the president not focused on all of America.
Yes.
And so when you think about how to solve that problem, if we don't think we can just click and have a new constitution, what do you think we ought to be doing?
Well, I think you and I are in agreement with this, where the ideal would be to have electoral votes allocated proportionally, so that even though I don't think Democrats are going to win Texas, it still might make sense for me to campaign in Texas if I can get some proportion of Texan voters to come my way and then end up getting electoral votes. Because I couldn't agree more. The problem right now is that your incentives are just to campaign in the 14 battleground states. So if you make it so that every state is a battleground, then your incentives change where you have to campaign everywhere.
Okay, and then what about this alternative, which many states have now passed, 12 states have now passed, the National Popular Vote Compact.
Yeah, the compact, right.
And the National Popular Vote Compact says that when the equivalent of 270 electoral votes have been committed to the compact, then the states who have agreed to the compact will pledge their electors to the winner of the national popular vote, regardless of who wins in their own state. So California, if a Republican wins, would send all of their electors to the Republican, regardless of the fact that the Republican lost in California. Do you have a view on national popular vote?
So I know that there's something really beautiful and elegant sounding about everyone's vote just counts for one vote, and then the national popular vote wins. And as far as I can tell, the compact, in some ways, tries to achieve the same result. But the issue is that then your incentives are to campaign in really big media markets, in really big population centers, and your incentives to campaign in rural areas or less densely populated areas are very, very low, because you're just trying to get as many people per time unit as possible. And so that's true if you get rid of the Electoral College, that's true with the compact. And you know, the electoral vote, the Electoral College has been in place for decades. You know, you can take issue with it, but we kind of know what it is, you know, and that is the way it was set up constitutionally. So I'm much more in favor of the proportional electoral vote by state as the fix than I am in either getting rid of the Electoral College or even the winner-take-all compact.
And that means you would even not favor the amendment, or would you favor the amendment? You just don't think it's likely?
You mean if I had a magic wand and say, hey, I could get rid of the Electoral College?
I thought you had a magic wand. You don't have a magic wand?
I do have a magic wand, that's true. Yes. I am not for just abolishing the Electoral College right now. And one of the reasons why I'm not for it right now is that there's like this sinking feeling I have that Democrats have lost a couple of elections based on the Electoral College and now are calling that system into question. Even though those are the clear rules and that's what it's been. And so to me, it's very unprincipled if your side loses to say, I need to change the rules because the rules are bogus. It would be different if the winning side were to say, hey, these rules are bogus, but it's hard for the losing side to then change those rules without coming across as very, very unprincipled.
Yeah, we lost a great opportunity, you know, after 2000, where obviously George Bush lost the popular vote but won the Electoral College. In 2004, if 50,000 votes had shifted in Ohio to John Kerry would have won the Electoral College but lost the national popular vote. And if you'd have a Democrat win after a Republican had won, I think then people would see this as a nonpartisan issue that we ought to address. But I do agree with you, it has this partisan valence, and maybe the last thing in the world we need right now is people to think that we're screwing around with the rules for partisan purposes. Okay, so here's my last question, my last push, the one I care the most about, so think of it as my punchline. Don't steal it. And then we're going to have questions, and to have questions, I have one that's written already by a really well-prepared young lady, so I'm going to ask that question first. She's 9, I think. But then we're going to have other questions, and we have more written here. So are we handing out these cards? Okay, so the cards are handed out, so I have all the questions here. So we don't have to have the lights up. That's all we're going to need. But here's my punchline question. So I was so happy to hear you say you're a supporter of H.R. 1. And just so everybody knows, H.R. 1 was a package that John Sarbanes in the House succeeded in convincing Nancy Pelosi to make as the first issue that Congress would take up. And that package of reform was the most ambitious democracy reform America has seen since the Voting Rights Act of 1965. It addressed the funding of congressional campaigns, not as ambitiously or aggressively as Andrew has described, but it was still an incredibly important system of public funding for those elections. It addressed gerrymandering. It addressed voting suppression by having automatic vote registration and a commitment to dealing with the Voting Rights Act to get back the protections of the Voting Rights Act that the Supreme Court has taken away. And it had a very strong package of ethics reform. And many people said it's a bad thing for Nancy Pelosi to do this because people will see it as just partisan, which of course is what happened when Mitch McConnell declared it to be just a Democratic power grab, which is a little puzzling when you say, how is it a power grab if you're just enabling people to be able to vote? But okay. But the point is, it became partisan, but what is inspirational about it is that all of a sudden it became conceivable that you could pass a law that would solve 85% of the problems we face as democracy. So my question is, that's H.R. 1. Would you commit to POTUS 1? Would you commit to making a fundamental package of reform the first thing you're going to push as a president to make sure that we have that as the first frame that enables us to have a democracy to think about everything else?
Yes, I would. And
okay, we get to clap for that right now, really loudly. Yes.
I'm going to carry the torch that you lit, Larry, across the finish line, because these process things, the struggles that they seem sort of arcane and technical, but they're actually fundamental. And that if you don't get them right, then you are sunk over time. So I love HR1, the fact that I was really impressed with the drafters. I was like, wow, they really actually like nailed a lot of stuff in this. And it infuriates me that the Republicans are not bringing it to a vote in the Senate. But as president, I would, if HR1 has not been made law at that time, I would do everything in my power to make it law. And calling it POTUS 1, I'd feel a little bad because really like the drafters deserve credit for the solutions. So maybe I'd make it HR1A and then sign that into law.
A little bit too humble to become president, Andrew. You gotta grab those. Okay, so it turns out Olivia Zink has an extraordinary daughter, Ellie, who has been fighting for reform next to Olivia, who's the leader of the open democracy movement here in New Hampshire. I didn't realize this, Ellie, but that was your question. So here was Ellie's question. If you became president, what would be the first thing you would do in office? Will you fix democracy?
Yes. Yeah. So I've been saying around the country the first thing I'm going to do is get people $1,000 a month because I'm going to work on that. But I will actually amend it all to say the first thing I'm going to do is put democracy back in the hands of the American people. Then the second thing I'm going to do is get you that money.
Wow. I think we can just go home now. We're finished. Okay. So we have a couple of people who are keen on the ranked choice voting question. I have at least 3 questions here. So just to be clear, you support the ranked choice voting in the presidential primary in New Hampshire?
Yes.
Okay, so here's a question that I think is related to what we've just seen. We all know how difficult it can be to get Congress to act on anything even remotely controversial. How do you plan to get your policies through, especially after you have to spend much of your political capital on getting the Freedom Dividend passed?
Well, the great thing about this vision for my presidency, so thanks to you all, I become president in 2021, and then everyone's like, wow, the Asian guy who wants to give everyone money is now president, so I guess we know how that happened, so he's going to come back and be like, hey, it's dividend time. And then the Democrats and progressives will be very excited about it, but then the independents and conservatives and libertarians will also be excited about it because many of them will see this as a path to economic progress and autonomy for their constituents. And one of the really wild learnings of this campaign is that I assumed that liberals and progressives would embrace me immediately and then I'd have a harder time with libertarians, independents, and progressives, and conservatives, but it's actually gone in reverse. Like, I've gotten a ton of support from Trump voters and libertarians and people who said, like, yes, like, this actually makes a lot of sense. And then it's been liberals and progressives that, for some reason, have had a harder time accepting, frankly, like a non-politician entrepreneur, because I think Democrats and progressives have, like, a much higher estimation of certain sorts of experience than perhaps other types of voters have. So it's been wild, but the way I can get this done is that it's not left or right, it's forward, and that as president, I'm just going to be completely non-ideological and solutions-oriented, and after I win, people will be very, very drawn to that approach. I can get a lot of good things done for the American people.
So here's something that we haven't moved forward on at all. How will you stop mass shootings in high schools and yoga studios and anywhere else people congregate? How do you counteract the political power of the NRA?
Yes, so this is a very, very difficult issue. It's going to be with us almost no matter what we do for a long time because there are over 300 million firearms in this country, almost one for every man, woman, and child. We're the most heavily armed society in the history of the world, and there is no like mass disarmament happening. So I am for what I would see as common sense gun regulation, federal background checks. The way I think about them is that, look, we have very serious licensing processes for automobiles because they can kill people, and so we should treat gun ownership in a similar light. But the things we can get done around trying to make mass shootings less commonplace, my brother's a psychology professor, and we need to have a massive mental health initiative in this country. We need to destigmatize mental health issues. We need to invest in a society-wide way. And one thing I'll do that's a small thing, but it may be important, I'll have a psychologist in the White House. Because then we'll just openly acknowledge, like, look, everyone has struggles. Like, there's no stigma attached to it. The powerful people that see the government, like, we need help sometimes. Everyone needs help sometimes. And this is one of the great projects of this age because we're undergoing a mental health crisis in this country. We're seeing record levels of anxiety, depression, problems, and even suicides. And as a country, like, what good is record high GDP if your people are unwell and even dying? And so we need to go very, very big in that direction. I think that can help on gun safety.
So on the UBI, we have a question. Is it likely that established interests would resist a tax on data and tech to fund the UBI? And how would you overcome that resistance?
So I have some friends in Silicon Valley, and when I go to them and I say, hey guys, are you automating away the jobs? They're like, yeah, I am, or we are. They don't say that in public. Let's say if you're like talking to them. And then you say, how do you feel about that? And almost all of them will say, not good. Like, I don't like the fact that my work is making other people's work less relevant. And then you ask them the big question, is like, are you willing to take a haircut and make a sacrifice in order to keep your country strong and whole? And then about half of them say yes. And then half of them say no. So it is not like a clean issue where this is not somehow us against them. My friends in Silicon Valley are generally just people doing their own jobs, but they are Americans, they're parents, they're patriots, and some of them are on board with a plan that helps keep their greater country strong and whole as opposed to trying to maximize every last dollar. And one of the things I say is, look, this is a better environment for progress and innovation if other people are excited about it. That it's not like Donald Trump is like a good sign for progress and innovation. That we need to get Americans excited about some sort of shared and collective progress again.
So what will the resistance be? What will the arguments be against the UBI? Is it anti-American, the UBI?
Well, again, a majority of Democrats now support it, and nearly a majority of independents and conservatives. It's like something like 40-something%. And so people are waking up to the fact that we need to think bigger about how to build a trickle-up economy that works for people again. I think the biggest barrier is really the sense of possibility, because most Americans cannot think big enough to think like that as a citizen, I'm entitled to a $1,000 dividend, or that as a society, we are easily wealthy enough to afford a $1,000 dividend for every adult. Most every American and most every human has a built-in mindset of scarcity, because that's the way we're programmed. And so if you go around saying something like, hey, $1,000 dividend, like for a lot of people, it's just, it literally just seems impossible. So one of the neuroscientists said to me, the enemy of universal basic income is the human mind. And so that, in many ways, is what we have to overcome. But what I'm happy to say is that people are waking up to the possibility of relative abundance every day.
So it's usually said, as Maine goes, so goes the nation. But I take it that the best example of UBI in America right now is Alaska, right?
Yeah, so Alaska in 1982, they implemented this petroleum dividend where now everyone in Alaska gets between $1,000 and $2,000 a year, no questions asked. And it's wildly popular, has created thousands of jobs, has improved children's health, has decreased income inequality, and it's been with them for almost 40 years. So what I've been going around saying is, look, if they did that with oil money, we can do what they did in Alaska for the rest of the country with technology money. And Alaska is a deep red conservative state. So again, it shows that this is not some kind of province of the left. This is actually something that's been in effect in an American state for almost 40 years now.
That's a really important point. This is a problem I really struggle with. I'd love to hear one of your 88 proposals for this. How does your presidency address the growing hatred towards government? How do you help people trust our government?
Yeah, so one of the things I've been saying is that, look, if our government had been functioning at the highest levels for the last number of years, Donald Trump would not have won in 2016. That there's been this growing lack of confidence we have in our government to be able to solve the big problems of this age. And so, not to oversimplify this, but just having the dividend pass is going to open so many people up to the fact that government can solve problems. Where, can you imagine a world where, again, I'm president 2021, the checks start going out, and let's call it 2022. Then the first time you get that check, you'll be like, it really happened. We really did it. I really have this money in my hands, and I can go spend it, like at the local store or business. And then people look up and say, wow, our government can actually do really good things. Like, what else can we do that's good? So the government, to me, in a way, the burden of proof is on the government to demonstrate that it can actually solve meaningful problems in an impactful way. Because unfortunately, many Americans have completely lost faith that that's possible.
So here's a question from a local hero, Diane Russell, who comes from Maine and was, I take it you were a waitress before you became a representative, and you could become a representative because Maine is one of the leaders for public funding of political campaigns. So she became a leader in the Maine legislature. And has been a big has been pushing she's been pushing ranked choice voting. But this is about none of those issues. So here's her question. The Federalist Society and the Judicial Crisis Network have effectively bought our Supreme Court. Will you support expanding seats on SCOTUS in federal courts to addressing conflicts of interest and or term limits? How far will you go to ensure the Supreme Court is fair to everyday Americans?
Yes. So the first thing I would push for is 18-year term limits for Supreme Court justices in particular and federal judges in general. Because to me, it is irrational that we're freaking out about the health of an 85-year-old justice. It's like, oh no, did she get a cold? Like, if she got a cold, then we're all sunk. And then you reflect on that for a moment, and you're like, wait a minute, like, why am I freaking out about the fact that Ruth Bader Ginsburg might have a cold? And the reason is that we have these lifetime appointments, and that has been one of the contributing factors in making each appointment like this firestorm. Because you feel like if they appoint this man or woman to the court, you're also looking at their age, being like, ooh, how long are they going to be alive for? It's like, oh, this is going to be with us for 25, 30 years. And so if you had 18-year appointments, which is what I'm pushing for, then it becomes more rational, more predictable. You have like a new appointment every couple of years, and then if you lose an election, you're like, okay, they get 2 appointments, instead of it being arbitrary based upon the health of the justices or the federal judges. Now, in addition to that change, I would be willing to at least consider expanding the number of justices, which, as Larry knows, is not set in the Constitution. And I thought that it was deeply unprincipled what the Republicans did to Merrick Garland, where there's nothing that says in the last year, like, president can't appoint someone. And the fact that they were rewarded for what I saw as deeply unprincipled behavior is very, very problematic. And I would be open to any means under the sun to try and balance that on the court.
Yeah, so let's talk about specifics. So Germany has a great constitutional court. It actually has about, I can't remember, it's like 17 justices, but they sit in 2 separate panels. And so you could imagine increasing in a substantial way. Obviously, you wouldn't say one party gets to appoint all the new justices. You'd have to make it fair so Americans thought it was fair. But you could get a much more regular turnover, which is, I think, the objective you have. Because in Germany, it's never an issue when a justice steps down because they know it's not going to matter that much. There's enough built into the system, enough of a buffer that the political system can handle it. So would you think of something that big?
Yeah, I would. I think expanding the number up from 9 would contribute in that direction. Plus, you know what would be super happy about this? Every law school student, because they'd be like, wow, the number of Supreme Court clerkships just went up. Oh, he's laughing because that's fine.
Yeah, but we who have to write the recommendation letters, we would not be happy about that idea. Okay, so here's one of your supporters who writes, I've been following you on social media, and I'm a big fan. However, I've also seen some tweets about issues that seem to be less popular with your fan base, such as lowering the voting age to 16. For issues like these, when you see the responses, do you ever reconsider?
Yeah, I see responses and I weigh them and I think, was there something I had not considered? When I was arriving at that policy. And there have been things that I've been moved on Though that is not one of them, because I've looked at the data and it strongly suggested to me that the benefits far outweigh the cons. But I 100% take any sort of feedback, particularly if that feedback has rationale that I had not considered. So I'm very, very open to that. I certainly would not consider myself to I'll give one example of something. I was in Iowa. It sounds so politician-y. We're here in New Hampshire. I was like, I was just in Iowa. But but I was with this high school senior who said that he walked around his high school and he has classmates with fentanyl patches on who are addicted to opiates. And he's like, what are we going to do? And I heard this, and I talked to him more about his experience, and he said that none of them are going to get help because they're afraid they'd go to jail, if they get found out to be using these illegal opiates. And my conversation with him made me think, it's like, wow, we probably should look at decriminalizing opiate use, at least, so that more people could seek effective treatment, which was not something I'd previously considered. So I feel like I'm learning and relearning all the time. I just want to share that. And that's something I would obviously, I'm now 100% for that. There are many people in New Hampshire that are struggling with opiates, and we need to get people treatment and not have anyone thinking that they're going to wind up in a prison cell, even as a first resort.
So here's an issue we don't talk enough about. What is your stance on military spending? How do campaign contributions by defense industries affect the amount of tax that taxpayers must spend on the military?
Yes. I'm for trying to rechannel. So we spend about $750 billion we know of on military each year. And a lot of that money is not necessarily going to things that are going to make us safer. And so we need to try and rechannel at least some of those resources to things that would produce higher levels of value for our society. So my plan is to try and channel it towards infrastructure, which then helps enhance economic growth and create jobs in a way that many of the people that defend military spending are chiefly concerned about. But we need to start trying to work on the problems of today, and a significant proportion of our military budget is being spent on things that we're guarding against threats from decades ago.
Yeah, and one of the dynamics here that I think plugs directly into the campaign funding is the military or the government will say it'll be better if we privatize this part of the military because the private sector can do it more efficiently than the government can. And of course, that plays into a prejudice. People think that's true. And then it turns out you privatize it and it's more expensive than when the government did it. Yet there are companies who get an extraordinary benefit from that privatization, and they're the ones who are driving these policies towards privatization. So the Halliburtons of America, who make extraordinary amounts of money on the basis of these killing machines.
I mean, you can sense that when you go to the D.C. area. Holy cow! It's there's an army of contractors and private firms just there to sort of just drawing resources out. It's like, oh, we can do it more efficiently, and it's like they can just make a lot more money. And so there's been this crony capitalism that has developed in this country, and then they extend this myth of the market and free competition, even when they're just shutting it down and consolidating in every way possible, and that certainly includes government contractors.
Yeah, and when you think about soldiers who are in the field, real soldiers, like people who work, in the Army or Navy or Air Force, and then they're working with these private contractors who are being paid more than the soldiers and live by different sets of rules than the soldiers. It really undermines the integrity of the whole process of the American defense industry.
Yeah, and it's not just soldiers. It's there are other, I work for this agency, and then I leave the agency, and then I come back as a contractor the next week, and all of a sudden my salary's doubled. I mean, that happens all the time, and it's deeply messed up. There's this thing where we've essentially martyred many of our public servants, and then they look at their counterparts who are working for industry getting paid 2 to 3 or 4 or 100 times more, and then they start feeling like they're idiots. And then the private sector is there. We have to stop. We have to try and reverse that dynamic as much as possible. So one of the things I've suggested is that we need to shut the revolving door between government regulators and industry, because right now when they come in, they already have their eyes on the lobbyist job, and if that's the case, then they'll never make any fundamental changes.
Yeah. So Jim Cooper, who's a Democrat from Tennessee, has been in Congress. He was elected in 1982. he says Capitol Hill has become a farm league for K Street. And what he means by that is everybody, members of Congress, staffers, bureaucrats, have this common business model. There's kind of fantasy that they're going to go from Capitol Hill and multiply their salaries sometimes by a factor of 10 when they step down and become lobbyists. And of course, if that's the way you're thinking, then you're not going to be eager to make the lobbyists upset. Jack Abramoff, of course, infamous lobbyist who's now become something of a reformer, and I consider him a friend, as odd as that might seem. But Jack Abramoff, in his really fantastic book, Capital Punishment, said the most effective technique I had as a lobbyist was going into a congressman's office and saying to the chief of staff, "So, John, what are you going to do when you're done here?" And the chief of staff says, "Jack, I don't know." And he said, "Well, I just want you to look me up when you're finished in this job." And Abramoff said, from that moment on, I owned that staffer, and not a single dollar had traded hands. And this is exactly because we have a system that allows this kind of revolving door.
I'm going to tell us, I went to Phillips Exeter, and I had a friend at Exeter who went and worked on Capitol Hill. He's a good person, wanted to do right, and he told me point blank, he was like, I would never be a lobbyist. Those people, are just here like, to try and pad their own wallets. And then he worked on Capitol Hill, and then 12 years later, he's a lobbyist. And so, I remember that conversation very well. He remembers it too. And when he told me what he was doing, that he was going to be a lobbyist, he was sheepish about it. He was sort of apologetic, but I understood it. Just because he'd been part of that system, and then when he came out of that system, they were just there waiting for him with the money. At that point, he took the money. So we need to really get into the guts of this system, because there's all of this soft corruption that then enables the hard corruption. This is someone I'm still friends with to this day, and he's not a bad person, but the system around him is corruptive.
This is a really important point. We don't have Washington filled with a bunch of criminals. Members of Congress are not bad people. All of them go to Congress, I think, whether you agree with their policies or not, for the right reasons. They're all trying to do good. But then they find themselves in the middle of the system that forces them, if they're going to survive, to behave like this. And so I think one really important thing is to stop vilifying people as if they're evil people and just take on the system, which I think is the interesting perspective somebody like an entrepreneur brings to this type of question. Because you look at problems and you think, what's the twist that might make this problem go away?
Yes, and I will say that I think you all, if you're here, you're thinking in these same terms. You're looking up and you're seeing that there's something twisted and messed up and imperfect about various processes, certainly campaign finance. And it's very tempting to then demonize people on the other end of it. And sometimes, they're doing really unsavory things. But what we have to do is we have to focus on fixing the system that is distorting and dehumanizing various people, turning them into economic actors very, very often. That is the mission that we all must be on. And I'm going to say right now, that mission will succeed or fail based upon the people here in New Hampshire. That you all have this almost sacred trust to try and safeguard the rest of the country from this broken down system that is on the verge of pushing us off this precipice, but after which there will be no coming back. And you can all feel it. We're all heading in that direction. That's why I'm running for president. I'm not running for president because I fantasized about ever being president. I'm running for president because I'm an American and I'm a parent, and I can see the country we will leave to our children, and it is not something that I'm willing to accept. Thank you all.
So now I see why they put the tissues up here for the...
I think that was because I was sort of nasal. I had to cold.
Okay, we have time for just a couple more of these really great questions. Here's a great one. Do you think that nuclear energy, especially nuclear fusion, or I'll say thorium, could be a solution to our reliance on fossil fuels? And as if everybody is cued to the right way to ask a question, this is tacked on. How do campaign contributions by energy companies shape or these energy policies?
Yes, I think that nuclear power, in particular thorium reactors, need to be a big part of the energy puzzle moving forward. And that if you do want to get off of fossil fuels, that nuclear needs to be a part of it, in my opinion. And that's what the studies and research I've seen. Like, nuclear gets a very, very bad rap because we have many associations with it. But a lot of those associations are with an earlier generation of reactor. And so I know some might disagree with this, but I believe that thorium reactors in particular are a big piece of a renewable energy future.
Okay. We have a bunch of questions from people from the ACLU who must be here, and I'm a card-carrying member, or I think it's in my wallet, but in principle. And they're asking about the Voting Rights Act, and I think you've addressed it, but let's just make sure. Do you support the effort to restore the Voting Rights Act and to deal with the problems that the Supreme Court has caused with the Voting Rights Act?
Yes, I'm 100% aligned with the goals of the ACLU in preserving the rights of the Voting Rights Act and rolling back some of the erosion that has occurred over the last number of years.
Okay. In New Hampshire, the legislature has enacted restrictions on voting, including requirements of driver's license and limits on early voting. Would you support efforts in New Hampshire to liberalize the opportunity of people to participate in the voting process?
Oh yeah, very much so. As you can tell, like I love efforts in that direction. New Hampshire's been a leader in many respects.
All right, here's one more hard question. I know it's a controversial question, but it's really important that people understand it better. Can you describe the value-added tax that you support in more detail? It seems like the objections to it are that the tax is passed to the consumer, which makes it regressive, so why would you support it?
Yeah, so a value-added tax is in effect in every other industrialized economy in the world except for ours. And the reason for that is that it's much, much harder for big companies to game. Like if you're Amazon, really you have to reflect on it. It's like, how the heck did Amazon pay zero in federal taxes? That's not their fault, it's our fault. We just designed a system that has enabled them to, and it's not an anomaly either. Their lifetime tax rate over all the years in business has been 3%. So 0% is like their norm. And their accountants are getting bonuses and the rest of it. So every other advanced economy has already figured this out, except for us. Now, the great thing about a value-added tax is that it gets the money from where the money is. It's almost impossible to game. The knock on it, which is accurate, is that people with lower levels of income spend a higher proportion of their money on various consumer goods, and so a value-added tax proportionally hits them harder. Now, happily, you can do what many other countries have done, which is you scale the value-added tax based upon the nature of the goods you're looking at. So you could exempt various consumer staples or have a lower rate on various consumer staples, and you could really stick it to people who buy yachts or really expensive things. And so the only drawback to exempting or scaling back the VAT on certain categories of goods is just you make less money, which is fine. So there's certainly going to be some scale involved in terms of the value-added tax. Would not be a blanket on everything. It is also the case that companies will try and pass some of that along to consumers. But you have to bear in mind too that the vast majority of Americans in a world with a freedom dividend would be seeing an increase in their buying power. And this $8 billion I was describing for the state of New Hampshire would far outbalance. Like you'd retain something like 80 to 85% of that in purchasing power. And it would be a net win for about 95% of Americans. Now, our income inequality is so grossly out of whack that the top 5% are holding a staggering amount of wealth. And so the question is, how do you get some of that 5% out? And the other measures that people are discussing, frankly, will not be as effective as a value-added tax. Because when Jeff Bezos gets his money, we'll get it from Amazon. But then you know what Jeff does with his money? He spends $1 billion a year on rocket ships to go to Mars for a company called Blue Origin that he has in his backyard. So then when he buys his rocket ships, we get some of that money too. You see, there's like no way out.
So here's a question about open primaries. So in New Hampshire, as you know, you can register as undeclared, and then on the day of the primary, you can pick which party you want to vote in. In the last election, maybe 25 million people were shut out of primaries because there wasn't something similar to that, or at least an open primary process. Do you think it's a good idea for parties to open their primaries, or do you think it makes sense for parties to figure out what their party cares about?
Probably not surprising you all, but I vastly prefer open primaries. I think having a diversity of perspectives is important. And also, if you're trying to win a general election, you have to appeal to people that might not already be registered members of your party. I think it was a huge mistake that the DNC is not having a debate on Fox. That made no sense to me. It's like, you do expect us to eventually try and win an election, right? And like, you know that a lot of people get their news from Fox, and that if they could see your amazing candidates a little bit earlier, maybe that would help us win a general election. So consistent with that, I am for open primaries. And thank you, New Hampshire, for having an open primary.
Would you encourage your supporters to engage with pressing their senators to get Mitch McConnell to bring H.R. 1 to the committee or to the Senate for a vote before you are elected?
Yes, I'm very happy to try and elevate the pressure on Mitch McConnell and the Senate to bring H.R. 1 to a vote by any means. And hopefully even being here with you all, this sort of event helps raise the visibility on this and keeps them from being able to bury it for the next number of days and weeks.
So many people in this room and so many people in New Hampshire have been fighting to try to get us a democracy back. I've been so grateful to be able to work with many of the people here, and I can't tell you, sir, how grateful I am that you would be the first person to join these fora to talk about what I think all of us recognize is the fundamental issue that we need to finally get us a democracy. So I want you to join me in thanking Andrew Yang for leading this charge.
Thank you, thank you. And let's give Larry a round of applause too. Thank you, Larry Lessig.
Really fantastic. Really well done.
Thank you. Yeah, it's easy when you actually believe all of the
Yeah,
things,
no, I can see that. That's
I
right.
don't have any other faces. Thank you all. Thank you, New Hampshire. I love you. Thank you.